I'm really honored to be moderating this panel because I happen to know everybody on this panel and really respect the work that they do and their commitment to justice. So thanks so much for being here. I'm going to start with the question we had in the title of this program, the term Euro-centric holiday. Why, in your view, are we using that term, Euro-centric holiday?
We call them Euro-centric holidays because they're established and they're upheld as cultural norms by people in this country of European heritage.
I think it's really important that we define the term culture because I think sometimes we use words, particularly race, ethnicity, culture, nationality, kind of interchangeably, and I think it's important to put it in context. Culture, the best definition I've learned for culture is the totality of thought and practice from which a people sustains itself, celebrates itself, introduces itself to history and humanity. And what that does is that it helps us to understand culture not just as a series of artifacts or a series, just merely song and dance, but what it does is that it helps us to understand culture as a paradigm, a framework for how people engage the world. And so when we talk about the term Eurocentricity, we're talking about a system of thought from which the cultural paradigm that has been used to sustain and to perpetuate European culture in its many iterations. And I mean, as the evening goes on, we can talk more specifically about what those tenets are. And there's a really vast set of literature that really helps to specify what the European cultural ethos is. But it helps us to define and understand the way in which the mythologies that people use to establish, certain cultural ideas and attitudes, and from which institutions are built. It is that cultural paradigm that helps to build the kind of mythologies and stories and holidays that people use to kind of craft their world around.
Well, I don't have much to add to what Devon said because he just captured it beautifully. But all I could add a couple of words to that is the fact that our holidays are defined by European ancestry at this point, and how the lens of which we view holidays is defined by that particular norm.
I'm going to be asking the panelists a number of additional questions, and then we're going to have a chance for all of us to have a conversation together. I think this is a topic that we rarely have a chance to really talk about. Maybe most of us really actively avoid it. Because it, I think, touches a lot of emotional buttons for people. I want to start initially focusing on what does it mean for people of color from different communities to be in a country where the major holidays we celebrate are these Eurocentric holidays, as you've described them.
I think one of the things, speaking specifically about the experience of people of African descent in this country, the devastation of the Middle Passage, what some of us refer to as the Maafa, and that disconnection, because people create a personality. When I say personality, I'm talking broadly. People develop an ego not in a pejorative sense, but develop an ego around the development of certain practices, rituals, mythologies, and typically they have fidelity to the experiences of the people from which those mythologies, come from. The trouble has been, particularly for people of African descent, and I'm sure applies to other folks in this country, other peoples of color, in different ways, is that the disconnection from Africa and the specific cultures that we came from in Africa means that in many ways we had to borrow traditions and practices that were antagonistic to stories that affirmed our own humanity. And at the same time, beginning to perpetuate mythologies that justify the racism and white supremacy in our society. And I think, one example, and I've heard comedians use this in a joke. You look at like Santa Claus, and it's like, this fat white man is going to go and give all, these toys and bring all this joy to all these children, but there isn't a representation of people of African descent, in some kind of mythology or holiday that brings that same kind of joy, right? And so that's just, to me, kind of a small example of the way that racism and white supremacy and this notion of Eurocentrism in certain insidious ways produces a narrative, kind of an internalized narrative that's disaffirming of the livelihood and the humanity of people of color.
So the way I view it, and kind of looking at it through a Latina lens, and please be assured that I am not speaking for all of my Latino people out there, because that's virtually impossible. So I could only talk to you about my experience and kind of put it into a personal context. So when looking at holidays from a Latina perspective of someone who has, my family are immigrants and they arrived to this country, the one thing that we wanted to do as a family unit was to assimilate, to not really make ourselves known as something different or make ourselves really hold on to some of that Cubanness or some of that Latina-ness or that the language, and kind of like learn English as quickly as possible. So that kind of shades my experience, and I think it also could be used to discuss what's happening with immigration reform and all of that, and to put that into context that we are today. But specifically to holidays, it's something where until there's an awakening of the spirit, I'll call it that, because I'm not sure what else to call it, where you start realizing that maybe this assimilation thing is not the way to go. Maybe we should be holding on to some of our culture. Maybe there's some strength that we have to offer as a community, something to tie into this fabric of what we believe the American dream is, and to give voice to that. So until you have that awakening that assimilation is probably not the best thing for not just ourselves individually or as a community, but more as a society as a whole, that you start to understand this concept of Euro-centric holidays. Because it's not something that many people talk about, nor is it something that I remember having dinner conversations about. I think we didn't even have it in our conscious. So this is something that I think we continue to struggle with, and that's probably why you'll get some pushback into saying, why are we even talking about this? This is not a big deal. People like to have parties, and let's have some cocktails. I'm a big fan of cocktails, by the way. So it's one of those things that needs to be discussed from an awakening perspective, where I'm not sure I could have had this conversation maybe 10, 12, 15 years ago, because I wasn't even aware that there was a problem with it until I became aware of the fact that my identity was being suppressed. And it wasn't just accidentally being suppressed. It was a systemic approach to the suppression of my culture and my roots, and understanding what that it means in today's society.
Speaking to the point of assimilation from a Native American perspective, and also wanting to say that I can't speak for all Native Americans, but coming from a member of the largest tribe east of the Mississippi, the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, our identity was formed post-contact. We are several different tribes, white and black, and the members of the Lumbee tribe are profoundly associated with the Southern Baptist Church. So you think about which holidays are celebrated in this country, many of them are based in Christianity, and they're really widely celebrated by Lumbees. That's a big part of the Native American population of this country, whose identity was formed in part by Christianity, embraced Christianity. So you wonder, at what point is it an attack? I mean, what part? It's conflicting identities within who you are. You have to get past that if you can. And then we have truly egregious holidays that should be egregious, in my opinion, to all Indigenous people, like Columbus Day in this country, where you have some states that celebrate Native American Day, other parts of the country that celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day. You think about what is America really celebrating on Columbus Day? That's not acceptable in any way from an Indigenous standpoint.
Well, Ashley, you've touched on what was going to be my next question, which is, are there holidays that are particularly difficult, upsetting, egregious for communities that do not come from a European background? Does anybody else want to address that?
I mean, I think the notion of holidays is complex because there are different kinds of holidays. Like, not all holidays are the same. So you think of something like Columbus Day. I think Columbus Day is clearly, not a holiday. It's not a holy day. And I think it's important that, in terms of what the difference is, because I think sometimes with holidays have political implications behind them. One good example of that is if you look at like Martin Luther King's birthday, that being a holiday. It's interesting that that's a holiday. The point of that is to incorporate the narrative of Martin Luther King into the narrative of the American nation state, to give it legitimacy, right? To give it the kind of legitimacy to undermine much of the racial justice work that folks are attempting to do. So that holiday has that kind of explicit purpose. But the other thing, too, is that some holidays, while the basis, the history of those holidays are problematic, serve really important roles and functions in certain communities. So if you look at like Thanksgiving, which also has a very egregious history associated to it, has also been a time that people come together as a family. Families come together and eat. And food is something that people build community from. It's an important part of bonding and community building. And so in that context, it can be very complicated to parse out the elements of it that is historically genocidal. But then understanding the role that the mere function of people coming together and convening can be important to the family as well. And so I think it's important in the context of talking about these holidays that we also talk about the fact that the attempt at cultural erasure that has happened, that in many ways sometimes these holidays serve as things that we're using to fill in spaces that have been erased as a result of the history of this country and the way that it's attempted to force everyone to assimilate into the American body politic.
So basically, you're not identifying one you find most egregious. Is that what I hear?
Right.
Okay. So I guess he made a very savvy move there by not identifying one. But I'm just going to go ahead and say Thanksgiving. And I'm just going to say Thanksgiving. I think not that it needs to be erased, because I think there is something very cultural and wonderful about the holiday and sharing and breaking bread and who do you invite to your house and how you're enjoying that with your family and friends. And oftentimes that might be the only time of year where there's no gift giving, nothing that is expected except just storytelling and eating. Watching football maybe, I guess, which that's another story that we could delve into, but we're not going to. But Thanksgiving has such a brutal history that I think it's hard for me to say just ignore it and just go about your daily life that day and break bread with your people. But it needs to be more of an analysis and one that really is thoughtful in saying this is the history that we've come from, and that we, in essence, are condoning that history by saying that we're sharing in Thanksgiving this particular way. So I'm not saying abolish it. I'm saying go ahead, have your family moments, but please recognize that there was a slaughter of people. It wasn't just a kumbaya moment with turkey, and I don't even know what they actually served that day, if people actually ate in harmony. So I don't know enough of that history to really talk about it, but there should be some recognition of the slaughter of people during that time, and then the appropriation, and then the basically the stealing of land. Like, all of that history needs to be discussed before we really embark on having an intimate moment with our family. And don't get me wrong, once again, I like the cocktails, and these discussions are very good over cocktails.
So while we're on Thanksgiving, just some historical information. The first Thanksgiving, there's two events that are debated what it could have been, really. One was a meal that did take place in Plymouth. The Indians associated with that event are the Wampanoags, who are still up there. Actually, they're everywhere. There's one in Baltimore City Public Schools. But so they weren't wiped out. We're still here. But miraculously, because this occurred after a contact that happened, a couple years before the Pilgrims we talk about got there, and the livestock they brought with them actually brought diseases that wiped out a third of the Wampanoag population, and it was a particularly hard winter. And the meal that was had by the Pilgrims, and the Wampanoags may have crashed the party. They may have never even shown up. And then around the same time, there was a massacre that occurred in Connecticut much of the Pequot people were wiped out. It was their Green Corn Festival, so that was their Thanksgiving. That was the holiday that fell at the same time, and there was a massacre. And that's why natives in New England celebrate a national, and rather than celebrate Thanksgiving, they have a national day of mourning every Thanksgiving. And a little bit more information on Columbus Day, which is celebrated widely in especially Latin America, where Columbus first made contact in the islands of the Caribbean. He contacted the Taino and the Carib Indians, and if you ask the descendants of these people, many times, I'm speaking from personal experience, they'll tell you that those Indians don't exist anymore when they themselves are the descendants of those Indians. So,
Well, I think each of you have touched on topics that I can just kind of hear the reactions of a lot of people I know saying, isn't this just a divisive topic? Why do we need to be talking about something like holidays and all the things you're bringing up just divide us instead of bringing us together? What would you respond to people who see it as a divisive conversation?
I would question folks who say it's a divisive conversation to examine their own position of privilege and whether or not they're feeling the negative effects of a division in this country.
Well, whenever someone says that something that someone is saying is dividing people, I'm always suspicious of that, because we live in a society that's already tremendously divided, and so that's just kind of a misunderstanding of the fact that there even is unity. And I think the fact that there is such disunity is the reason why I think a lot of these holidays become such cornerstones in American society that don't get critically engaged or questioned to the extent that they should. And I think the other piece too is that I think that for some people, because we are in a society that encourages people to assimilate, there's a part of that response that I think is genuine, in the sense that there are people that can't imagine a world where it makes sense for those holidays to represent what they represent. So a part of the work is to get people to understand the nature of the society that we live in, so that it isn't seen as just factoids that people are throwing out at folks, but it helps people to understand the importance of how you build a community is around the things that you celebrate. And if you're celebrating things that represent something that is detrimental to a people, that's an important thing to discuss. So I think engaging that piece where people are just genuinely misinformed, I think is an important part of that.
I would look at the question a different way, and I would kind of encourage them to say, if you believe in this United States of America, if you really believe in that type of story and that message and the American dream and what that means, then shouldn't we encourage all of our stories, all of our people who habitate the United States, to be able to share their story and to live their life and their experience? And if one of the things that we really value is multiculturalism, whatever that definition may be for them, wouldn't it be in essence something that you're learning and you're gaining experience from hearing someone else's story? Now, that's probably one of the kind of a softball approach to dealing with this issue, but oftentimes people aren't ready to hear that we're in a divided America. We have to meet people where they're at, and to have a conversation about race when someone has blatantly said this is divisive, they're probably not ready to hear about how the United States is divided and how we treat people as second-class citizens, or how we marginalize people and we don't provide education and we don't provide health care, we don't provide food and water for our people. They're probably not ready for that conversation, but they might be ready to engage in a conversation about how they view America and what that means about inclusiveness. Because most people are going to tell you they're not racist. So don't call them a racist right off the bat, because that's not going to get you anywhere. That'll just get you kicked out the door. So starting a conversation just a little bit further back, or actually I'm going to say quite far back, and where they're at, to have that and engage in a conversation of what you believe America to be might not be it, but let's work together to get there. So it's a softer approach.
Davon, I'm going to put you on the spot, taking us back to one of your earlier responses where you mentioned Martin Luther King holiday, and you described it as designed to undermine racial justice. Not your exact words, but my paraphrase of it. Can you say a little bit more about how you see it that way?
If you look at Dr. King's legacy, he's profoundly more radical than people know. You know, if you read Triplet of Consciousness, Where Do We Go From Here? You know, he has a really important piece a speech he gave, Black Power Defined. You know, these are all really important pieces of work that really helped to shape the work he did at the end of his life, and what he thought. And, you know, what's really interesting was that, you know, the making Martin Luther King's birthday national holiday was very controversial at the time. You know, that it didn't come. I mean, he was assassinated in 1968, and I believe it didn't become a holiday till the 80s during the Reagan administration. And so it was a long time before it became a holiday, because much of what he stood for, you know, he was against the Vietnam War and was really vocal about it. And so much of what he stood for was really antagonistic to the national consciousness at the time that he was assassinated. And so it took a while after folks could conveniently forget many of the more radical elements of his legacy that he could, you know, then, you know, a holiday could have been created in his name. And what it does is that because it becomes a national holiday, it's a way in which people are instructed to see Martin Luther King's legacy as being in lockstep with the national interest, the dominant national interest, in a way that, you know, I mean, because to me, it's nuts to me that there's a King monument in Washington, D.C., a place where, you know, so much of the most egregious, you know, policies, foreign and domestic, are carried out in the name of a country that, you know, says to celebrate his legacy, when he wouldn't have supported the invasion in Afghanistan, Iraq, the invasion in Libya, you know, the drone strikes. I mean, there are all these things that he wouldn't have supported. But again, most people don't know that. And so it helps to conveniently conceal the fact that his legacy would have caused many of us to question what the United States does, instead of understanding, instead of going along with the holiday to kind of ceremoniously put King out there as more of a symbol and not the substance of his legacy.
Just to follow that, I'd like to say the day after Thanksgiving in the state of Maryland is American Indian Day. And that was an accomplishment of the Maryland Commission on Indian Affairs, on which I now serve. But I just want to put this out there. Does anyone see the irony on Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, that it's American Indian Day, the day the capitalism and the greed of this country goes wild, and that's the day we choose to honor the indigenous people that were nearly decimated due to the greed and capitalism in this country. And the reason it was put into legislation so easily was because everybody already had the day off.
I was reflecting as you were talking about that kind of reinterpretation of King that has happened, that all of these holidays seem to be based on a narrative, a story that is either totally false or a tiny piece of the truth, and shaped to have it match a system of Euro-centric thinking and of white supremacy in this country. So we're kind of seeing the Martin Luther King holiday, you know, be transformed, you know, during our lives in that way, which is kind of an interesting thing to actually witness. Nobody's mentioned the 4th of July. And that's one particularly that, again, a lot of people get together with families on that day, really have a good time, enjoy the fireworks. And certainly many families in communities of color celebrate that holiday. And many people would say, why are we asking this question and why are we criticizing these holidays? Do you have anything in particular to add, in that context?
Proportionately more Native Americans than any other ethnic group, racial group in this country have served in the armed forces, and they weren't even citizens until 1924. Okay, that's every single conflict, war from the Revolutionary War on, even the French and Indian War. So 4th of July is a big thing among many Native populations to this day, notwithstanding the fact that it only celebrated the independence of people of men of European descent, Christian men of European descent. So, something to think about.
I guess the only thing I would add, 4th of July, like, the other holidays we mentioned, it's a celebration of the, establishment of, white nationalism in the Western world, in the Western Hemisphere. And I think what is interesting, I taught middle school for a couple of years, and I remember trying to give an assignment I was teaching African American studies, and the assignment was for them to read an excerpt of what Frederick Douglass had said about the 4th of July, which he, pretty much says it's not independence for us, it's independence for white folks. And what's interesting is that the response I got from the students, they were like, well, what's the 4th of July? Isn't that when we do cookouts? Isn't that when we we hang out, we grill? They didn't really understand the substance of 4th of July. They just knew you were supposed to go see fireworks and do cookouts. And so I think, how that's a part of, I think, the problem that we face is that there are people that don't even understand the substance of the holiday to understand what they're celebrating represents something much bigger than a cookout or fireworks. And so I think that's a part of why this conversation is important, is to get people to actually think about that.
I think that 4th of July is one of those particular holidays where I think for me it makes it really clear what is happening in the United States, and that is white supremacy, white privilege, who gets to define the reality of the society, of our community. Because it's very much saying, here's the day that we were free. And that's the message. And maybe it's not the message that we kind of sit down and really analyze like we probably should. But it really goes to this, what is white privilege? What is it to be and to have your story be the dominant story for all of the United States? I think that says a lot, and it's very deep to think about that. Because are we not excited? Aren't we elated and proud of our country for the emancipation of enslaved people? Why are we not talking about that? Is that something that's interesting? Is that a question that we should even bring up? But it's something that, as a country, we never really celebrate that. And if we do, it's celebrated in not local levels or something like that. So it's really talks to that privilege and who gets to define the holidays. And I think that's what this whole panel is about, is that the white story, the Euro-centric story that's being told throughout each holiday. And 4th of July is one that really exemplifies that.
One kind of undercurrent I'm hearing in some of the comments that you're making is that you see some opportunities, actually, in the conversation about Eurocentric holidays. Am I hearing that, or how would you describe that if you see it?
So opportunities in having this conversation with people. So I think a forum like this is fantastic. Unfortunately, I don't think these forums occur a lot. And I think there's also some social pushback every time you have this conversation. And it comes at a personal cost as well. Because if you are really having an interesting dialogue on this particular topic, or any topic related to race, it's going to be one where people may look at you like, what are you talking about? I don't understand. You're just stirring the pot. You're making it more difficult for everybody. Why do you keep doing this? And I remember my progress of someone who's been working on anti-racism work as well as other oppressions, is that when I first started talking about this, I was very clumsy. I was very ungraceful about it, where I was so angry and so frustrated with it, where now I've come and developed a place where I could talk about this without investing too much of my personal self. And that investment in personal self is difficult because you may alienate people, and in turn, they may not like you. And that's hard because we all want to be liked and cherished and thought smart and brilliant and all the rest. but there is a cost to having these conversations. And like for me, for example, every time I do one of these panels, I get a little worried. I'm an attorney here in this grand state of Maryland, and I do a lot of work across the country. So when I talk about racism, I have to also realize that I'm in a position of power and that people will judge me, and they will either hold this for me in my career or against me in my career. So it has to be a very thoughtful conversation that I engage in, because there is a personal cost to having these conversations. And that happens to all of us in whatever sphere we're in. If we're a student, have this conversation with a friend, or having this conversation as a teacher, or at any place in this country where you're having a conversation about race, it becomes very difficult. And that's kind of the opportunity, and the challenge arises from the same place. But it's always this question of how much are you willing to put out there to change the world? And that's a hard question to ask of yourself and others. So it's going out there and really trying to reach people where they're at, and also be forgiving and embracing of where you are in this process to have those conversations.
I think one element of the conversation that is important, because again, there are folks who live in a social material context where the holidays represent other stuff in terms of opportunities for folks to convene, to build a sense of community. So for instance, one thing I would advise against, crashing someone's 4th of July and yelling at us, everyone, and saying, "Oh, you all are celebrating white folks' freedom. You're all stupid and should stop doing it, and you're all terrible people." Because, and the reason for that is because while it's important that we talk about the context from which people build their livelihoods and build their communities around, it's also important that you address the material conditions that people are situated in as kind of the primary thing that we're addressing. These conversations, I think, are important in the context of how do we craft a different world than the one that we have. But I think it's important not for this conversation not to be a way that people not use this conversation as a reason to be self-righteous, to like beat up on people who don't get it, because I think sometimes we can do that. Like those of us who understand this stuff can really just beat up on folks because it feels good to kind of intellectually bully people into forcing them to admit that what they're doing is wrong. I think it's important in particular context, if you're sincere, it's important to really address the context that people are situated in first, and that be the gateway to the conversation, right? So that as you're building community and developing authentic relationships and engaging in those struggles for people's liberation, that becomes the authentic connection from which you can start to forge these conversations where they can be productive.
I like to make I statements. I like to speak from my own point of view. That's really the only place I can speak from authentically. And I like to ask a lot of open-ended questions. And in the desire to meet people where they are, which is truly the only way I think these arguments or these facts will be received, you have to do just that. You can present history, history from your perspective, from your people's perspective, what you know to be true, and you can have a conversation, make I statements, ask a lot of open-ended questions, and start in your house with your family. Start at home, and definitely speak with young people, because you'd be surprised what's still in the curricula in our schools today, what they still think really happened on Thanksgiving, what they still think 4th of July is really all about.
We had fourth panelist who was unable to make it tonight, who is a white woman who's also a member of Baltimore Racial Justice Action. And I would have started with her with this next question, which is what responsibility do white people have around the issue of Euro-centric holidays?
Well, the reason I could address it is because I'm light-skinned. I'm a light-skinned Latina, and that brings some privilege with it, where I can pass for white, and often people will confuse me as white. So I've gotten this question before from a friend, actually, where he asked me one time, why do you make such a big deal about being a Latina? You look white, so why don't you just enjoy it? Which, in it of itself, okay, he's not my friend anymore. But that was that was part of the process of growing and coming to terms with relationships there. But that's an offensive question all in and of itself. But there is some truth about that, and that is that I come from a position of privilege where I have light skin. So my reality is very different to people who are Latino, who are darker than I am, and African American, and people who are of different ancestries who have darker skin. They may experience racism a lot different than I do. So I can't speak to that reality. So my response to my then friend is, the reason I make a big deal about it, and I'll put big deal in quotation marks here, the reason I make such a big deal about it is because if I don't give voice to what is being experienced, and if I don't stand up for my brothers and sisters who are people of color, then who else will? Who else will give a voice, and who else will stand up and make known the history, make known the experience of people who've been marginalized in our communities? So what is my responsibility, not as an Euro-centric, but I'm sure I have some Euro-centric background in me because I am light-skinned, is to say, give a voice and stand up, because oftentimes when you're the only person of color in the room or one of a few, it's a hard burden to carry to make sure that the voice of your people are heard. It's too much. And your experience can't define the rest of your community. And sometimes you just are tired. You're tired of being there and hearing all these things that are upsetting. So as someone who's light-skinned, someone who's white, it's a lot easier for you to say, listen, this is what this means. And what you're saying is offensive, oppressive because of this or that. So I think that's my role, and why I believe, and I hope my white friends take their responsibilities of ending racism as seriously as I do, not just because I'm affected, but because they have privilege and they have that power.
I would like to second that as another light-skinned person of color, and I'd also like to offer that I'm half white, and I'm going to tell you an Indian joke. I'm half white, but I can't prove it.
Are there any holidays that you would like to see added to the national calendar that would reflect the multicultural nature of the U.S. population?
I would say Cesar Chavez, and I think that's been in the making for a long time. And it's not just because he's Latino, but also to really discuss the right of workers and the mobilization of these workers and the work conditions that are faced here in the United States. And those conditions haven't changed much since the time where he was leading groups of people. That's still a reality today, and it's a reality in many, many states, from California to Florida to Georgia to everywhere, to New York State, and here even in our state of Maryland, where there's wage theft and there's retaliation and abuses of people and actually human trafficking. So those things still exist today, and I believe that particular holiday would not just celebrate his life, his contribution, but also talk about the rights of workers, empowering them, and also what capitalism sometimes does to our community. And by sometimes, I mean a lot.
See, holidays are weird because there are a lot of celebrations that people have around important events. One of my fears is that, and this is kind of a uniquely American problem, I would say, that holidays tend to represent, in a lot of instances, the egos of those who put the holiday out. If you think of we go back to like Thanksgiving, or you think about Christmas, it has a lot to do with, mythologizing a historical narrative that celebrates the ego of those who put it out. And so, I don't know. The danger, even like Kwanzaa, I have mixed feelings about Kwanzaa because, I have mixed feelings about Maulana Karenga and, the person who founded it and some of the things that he did, personally, so it's weird. I think the thing that is the prerequisite is for communities, particularly, for folks of African descent in the United States, a development of a sense of cultural identity. I feel like when black folks talk about the development of cultural identity, it's seen as much more of a divisive thing, I think, than other ethnic groups. It's seen as, the term reverse racism, why does it have to be black? Those are questions we get when black folks, when we decide to have something that has cultural fidelity to black folks. And so for me, that's a prerequisite before we can start kind of suggesting the holidays that we should have, because otherwise you'll just have random people, who have a good idea coming up with holidays without it being based in something that's communal.
I think it would be cool if the whole country could celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day like they do in Berkeley, not Native American Day as they do in South Dakota, because technically anybody born in American soil is a Native American, and not American Indian Day because, as we know, that's a misnomer.
Thank you all very much. We want to bring all the rest of the people in the room into this conversation. And I'm going to give you all the last question that we had on the list to ask the panel, and ask you to initially get into groups of maybe 3 people and get into that group with somebody you don't already know, so you can share some things, across lines where you don't already know what the other person's going to say or likely to say. And that question is, what can families do differently if they want to respond to the issues that the panel has raised about Euro-centric holidays? What can families do differently if they want to respond to some of the issues that have been raised here this evening?
I'm Shauna, and I just want to thank everyone for being part of the panel, and I'm very happy to be here, and thanks to BRJA for having it every month. I love it. Thank you. And we were discussing one of the things that I thought, is probably the most radical that is also feasible, because people aren't going to give up their food and their family and their day off of work, considering worker conditions in this country. So I think the most logical thing for white folks like myself is to actually talk to all the kids that are around the table and actually tell them what the holiday means, knowing that the curriculum is not going to tell them, and just hope that their children's naturally sort of like almost self-assuredness, or lack of embarrassment sometimes would maybe prompt them to correct their teachers if they hear information that doesn't sound right to them. So that's all. Thanks.
I want to invite the next person who'd like to share to come up. And meanwhile, that just reminded me, there's a children's album called Rainbow Sign that has a song called Someone Was Already Here that's about Columbus. And my 4-year-old granddaughter can sing it, which I can't wait for her to go to school and, share it with her mates. Who else wants to report from their group?
I think it's important to keep in mind that in a lot of urban and, essentially my neighborhood, African American neighborhoods, most of us don't even know what the holidays are. We don't care. It's a chance for us to come together and not fight and pick at one another or, just tear down each other. It's a chance for us to build up our own families, not caring that Thanksgiving was a massacre, not caring that, what happened, because most of the people in my community are troubled and have, different kind of issues with drugs and mental issues and things like that, and don't know where they come from. If they do have Indian background or whatever, they don't even know where they come from or if they have those backgrounds in them. So I think we should focus on the immediate rather than, and then go back to the past. Because immediately right now, in the urban neighborhoods that I am affiliated with, the only thing that matters is now. The past doesn't really matter because we don't even know about it. And I feel like if we start from here and then move kind of backwards to showing them how, okay, this is how it is now, and okay, you don't know where you come from and this and that, but how it would benefit you to know, and how it would benefit your offspring to know all of these issues and things that are raised.
The young lady sitting in front of me suggested that sometimes if you change things, you're ostracized or looked funny upon in your neighborhood. But I was a single mother. And one year, I think my son might have been about 10 or 11. In October, I was just paying for the Christmas gifts from last year. And I decided at that moment that I wasn't giving no more Christmas gifts. I didn't care what the rest of the family thought or said. And if they said anything, it was probably behind my back because they probably didn't think I was wrapped too tight anyway. But I told them that I would cook dinner and I would prepare the whole meal and I'd buy the food. And that would be the Christmas gifts to everybody because it was 6 of us. And when you're talking about the nieces and nephews, I mean, if you give $5 gifts, it was a lot. So they were all happy with that. They didn't have to bring anything, they have to do anything. As a matter of fact, most of them wouldn't even clean up. So that's how I settled that, and that was before I even thought I was a revolutionary.
So this is back to your comment about Latina identity and realizing that, you know, as you grow older and learn about these things, you realize, am I suppressing something? Am I suppressing my past? Am I just assimilating? And I think I'm going to go home for Christmas break and ask my mom and my sister those same questions. Even though my mom came from New York, she was born in New York. Her parents were not born in New York. They were born in Puerto Rico and moved to New York. Did they have to assimilate to this Euro-centric holiday? Yes, because my mom learned those things and then I learned those things. So I wonder what holiday my grandparents would have been celebrating in Puerto Rico, but I can't even know that because they're no longer with us. So we just need to bring these critical questions to the table in a very open, positive, and productive conversation that doesn't anger the family and doesn't make the holidays seen in a negative way. Like, I just want them to be happy because it's the only time we come together. So, yeah, that's what I'll do. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Good evening. Kuala said, well, I guess my family is just very proud of their European background and the accomplishments, etc., you know, in terms of holidays. So I asked the question of 2 of the young ladies. I said, are you familiar with the word chemistry? Of course. They said yes. I said, well, do you know where the word chemistry came from? And I said, Kemet. You ever heard of Kemet? No. Have you ever heard of Egypt? Yes. You ever heard of ancient Egypt? Yes. Have you ever heard of the African name for ancient Egypt? Kemet? No. And this pride that's out here because our populace is untaught. We're not taught who we are. All of us. Who are all of us? And what is all of our learning, really our intellectual foundation, our mathematics and science? There's a book called Harmony, and I call it so. The stem we have here, the ancients had a harmonic stem, the science, the math. Talked about nature, our beauty in nature. And so this young lady talked about family just want to be happy. That's bottom line. Joy in the present moment. So I think the more we're taught about who we are, and a lot of that learning, comes from, there are plenty of books out here. But there's a book that I recommend to all. It's called Harmony, the harmonic interrelationship of all things. And it talks about the ancient story and also how Pythagoras spent 22 years learning his math in Kemet. Okay. So, I mean, I think the enjoyment can be really deepened and widened with truth, with teaching, and embracing the human family. And that book was written by the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles. And he talks about Western thinking in terms of linear, mechanistic, and so forth. And he lifted up the golden thread of humanity, ancient Egypt, and how the knowledge, when that fell, passed on, etc. So there is a yearning locally and internationally for the human family to relearn itself and embrace itself, joy in the present moment. Okay.
So I know that at least one of the things that we discussed in our group was the emphasis on, generally for a holiday, there's a lot of emphasis on, a particular narrative, a story that's related to that day. And aside from whether or not that narrative is true, there's also just the fact that it's hard to understand that narrative without knowing the historical context for it. So, one thing, for example, if you want to teach children about the idea of Thanksgiving, what exactly would it have meant for them to live during that time? And on top of that, I think it's important that if you're going to expand their knowledge of the historical context of certain holidays, that you're bound to make them want to question other things. And in that way, it kind of predisposes them to just be inquisitive. So if you take a certain setting that you just, with family, something that's very safe and homey, and you allow them to be curious about things, I think that's something that they will extend into, school, and, maybe they will start questioning their teachers because they're so used to doing it at home that they feel comfortable with that kind of thing. Whereas I think if you kind of discourage that kind of inquiry because you kind of want your child to grow up with a PC mindset or something, that's something that's going to stay with them when they're older. So all of a sudden when someone else comes around questioning those things that they take for granted from childhood, now all of a sudden it seems threatening, and they're going to say something like, oh, you're being divisive, So that's kind of my thoughts on our small group.
I understand when he said how to get children to understand what's going on, but I have in my family, all of the older people in my family, and my mother, and my grandmother, and they don't know. And when I try to express the things that they need to know in order to, move past or understand, they won't grasp it, don't want to grasp it, and it kind of closes me up to, well, maybe I shouldn't be trying to, give you this information because you don't want it. I don't know how to approach that because my grandmother didn't go to school. My great-grandmother, it's like uneducated kind of in almost every way. And when I try to come and I'm just shut down. So I'm trying to figure out how to get past that point in order to, I have nieces and nephews that I could, try to expand their growth mentally, but they do, spend time with my grandmother and people in my family who don't feel as though these things are important or that I should even be bringing this negativity to our family.
So I'm going to ask the panel to address Nakia's question.
I really firmly believe that everyone's an expert in their own life. So I think maybe it's just my personal favorite point of entry, but if you ask your family to tell you their stories, ask for their stories, and then ask why did things happen that way? Why did they feel that they had to make this choice or the other choice, or how did they end up in this circumstance? Keep asking why, because they know more maybe than they even realize that they know about how they ended up where they are, how they are where they are right now at the end of history. Like right now we're at the end of history. How did we get here? they lived this long, they know a good deal about how they got here. If you still have your grandma to talk to, that's awesome. No, ask questions. She's lived as long as she's lived. Ask why. And you can do that to the point of frustration. So I would say ask to the point that you're still well received, and then come back, ask again a little bit later, get some more stories.
Yeah, I mean, I would just quickly say, some people are where they are in terms of how they see the world. And sometimes I think we want people to agree with us in the moment that we tell them things. And I just think, it's a process. It's one of those things where, like I actually said, you bring it up. And, the conversation will be an ongoing conversation, especially, when you get, I'd imagine that, you get to a certain age and you feel like you know a lot about stuff and you're unwilling to change things that are fundamental to who you are. So, I don't know, I just think it's a process, it's a conversation.
I could say that, so my parents are immigrants, as I mentioned before, and I had the same political views and same structural beliefs that they did for a very long time until I had the aha moment, the awakening. And once ignorance is bliss at some point, because you could go on with life thinking that everything is perfectly fine until you have that awakening and all of a sudden it changes. And then once that awakening happens, you want to share that information. You want to try to share your knowledge and helpfully change their perspective or their world to make it better. But for my parents, it was a big struggle because they came here for the American dream. And they sacrificed so much for this American dream of coming to a country where they didn't know the language, where they had to live in poverty, where we had to struggle for things. So to come to them once I got this enlightening, and it was during college, coming to them and saying, I just want to tell you that we live in a racist society and, go on, and poverty and homophobia and all of the isms that really oppress us as a nation, that was too much. It almost shattered the whole reason they came and sacrificed for us. So over years and decades, we kept having these conversations, and even to my mom's dying day, when I said, Mom, I'm going to marry my wife, and will you come? And she was like, Muchacha, está loca, which means, are you crazy? Little girl, are you crazy? And here I am, a grown woman. And for that moment, I was like, wait a minute, am I crazy? Am I living a life that's a lie? Am I living something that's not a reality? But for her, culturally, that whole concept of, and she knew I was a lesbian for a very long time, so it wasn't like earth-shattering her to that I was gay, but this concept of what society would think of you, or what is marriage in the cultural context of my people, that was too much. And that's after working with this, undercovering the oppressive nature of our society with her for many years, it was still too much at that moment. So all I could say is keep working at it. They're going to think you're crazy, which, that's their opinion of you, and that's okay, but they still love you, unless, it gets to be too much for them, I don't know. But it's kind of like that process of awakening that can't be rushed or can't be pushed on someone. It has to be their own truth and their own reality to shape and inform that discussion.
Earlier you mentioned that at one point you were so angry and you found yourself being ungraceful with these conversations. When I heard you say that, I thought, wait, isn't she assimilating anyways? Like, to make people happy, to make them comfortable? I find that I have to be careful about what I say, especially at my school at the Maryland Institute College of Art. I'm going through that awakening right now. It happened 3 months ago when I did the Latino Museum Studies program at the Smithsonian, and I realized, oh my God, as a curator, I am assimilating and only representing white artists in my exhibitions as a Latina curator, and now I'm changing that completely and trying to change the conversation at my school. And I think my colleagues are thinking, wow, she's just getting like really angry all of a sudden. Like, when did this happen? Like, why does she care all of a sudden about her people? So what do you think about that transition and the idea, like, how do you feel about having to be graceful? And is that assimilating?
So is it assimilating? Yes, I believe it is. And the reason I say that is because we do have a societal norm, and that societal norm has been defined by people in power and in the majority, and that is namely white people. And they have decided what language is appropriate, how to have a conversation, what polite gestures should be made. That has all been defined for us. And by me acquiescing to that particular behavior, I am perpetuating it. There is no way around it. So the one thing I discover is that for me, the reason I adjust my message depending on the crowd, who I engage with, how much I want to fight back, how angry I want to be, really depends on what I want to accomplish. Do I want to enrage and anger? If I don't like you and I don't think I'm going to reach you, chances are I will enrage and anger you. But if I feel like there's a little glimmer of hope that somewhere you're going to move from where you are to a more progressive, a more inclusive place, I'm going to deliver my message a little bit tempered, because I want you to keep listening to me. I want you to still get engaged in the conversation. I want to make sure that we're there. But there is a cost to that, because sometimes I may feel enraged and I have to think and then the other question I have to ask myself is, am I enjoying my privilege? Am I enjoying the fact that I'm light-skinned? Am I enjoying that I have a higher education? Am I enjoying that I no longer live in poverty? Am I enjoying that I'm an able-bodied person? Am I enjoying that I was once a Christian? Am I enjoying all of these things too much in this conversation? And if at one point the bell goes off and says ding, that's when I have to start analyzing and say, okay, what my thought process is right now is enjoying that privilege, and it's oppressing someone else. So that will kind of temper my dialogue also. But there is a cost to this type of conversation and message. So I think for you have to determine where on this, because I honestly believe this work comes along a continuum. You have people who are radical. They like radical thinking. They love to push buttons and to get people having a conversation. And then you have people who are more, they temper their speech. They're not really that activist. So you need people at both ends to kind of push people to get to the middle. And you have to decide, are you a radical? Are you someone in the middle? Or are you someone who really doesn't care about these issues? So that conversation, and only you can decide that and what cost that is to you.
What, past just having these conversations around the dinner table per holiday, like what extra little thing can white people do to sort of like counter the Euro-centric narrative to all these holidays? And of course, I'm thinking more about Thanksgiving and Christmas just because they're coming up. But I would be very curious to hear about other warmer holidays too. But, is there like collect small donations from everyone at your table and go to this specific charity, or do a little small action, just one past talking?
I don't know what I would tell white folks to do about what to say to other white people about the holiday. I don't know if the white person wants to answer that question.
As a white person, I'll provide some answer to that, and then also invite anybody else in the audience who'd like to address it. I think each of these holidays presents an opportunity for white people who wanted to address the oppressive nature of some of these holidays and the confusion that it creates, not just for people of color who are affected by it in an obviously negative way, but for our own families and particularly our own children who are being fed a false sense of history and a false sense that these days mean the same thing for everybody. So to me, each one is an opportunity to not, hammer people over the head with the history and the events, but to talk about it, just to talk about it and tell the story. Children love hearing stories, and we can tell the real story in a way that acknowledges the realities and brings us to the present and opens that door to say, there are lots of different people in this country, and together we all make up the country, and we have lots of different ways of celebrating and acknowledging our own culture, our own religion, whatever it might be. But to just open that door for the whole picture instead of just that tiny piece of it that we've been taught. Anybody else?
I know that with my family, if I suggested we go, we have this discussion and we go to a charity, people would sort of be like, oh, we did our good deed. We're such good white people. So I'd be personally very careful about doing that type of service work with people who are just either don't get it or want to get it or are somewhere in there but aren't actually it hasn't clicked yet.
Is there something between discussion and huge protests and marches on Washington that people can do, when they are of an activist leaning, that are actually productive and do something? Or is the really just the most important thing to spread knowledge amongst ourselves, I guess?
And this is kind of a larger response, but we always seem to want to do something huge, to do something big, and we take the emphasis off the day-to-day acts of resistance that we need to be doing. For me, this discussion about holidays doesn't happen just around the holidays. It happens all year through. And every time when we take a stand, whether it is on the 4th of July, reading Frederick Douglass's What is the 4th of July to a Slave, and then talking about it or even mentioning it within that context, or, even in May, or when our children come home from school and talk about Thanksgiving and what they heard, or 4th of July and what they heard, that we take that as teachable moments to talk about this. So at the Thanksgiving table, when everybody has expectations and is having a good time, maybe that's not quite the place, but the place is before then in the planning. The place is that if everybody goes around and says one thing that they're thankful for, then you take that opportunity to note some real history on the day. The movement on all of this, on all of oppression, is not necessarily the huge steps that we do. It is the small, consistent steps that we do. And that is the thing that brings about lasting and systemic change.
I made note of the fact that you mentioned that it took time for you to become aware of these sort of issues, and you said that you became aware of the fact that they weren't accidental, that they were systematic. Can you give an example of what sort of experiences led you to, because I think a lot of people do tend to see a lot of the racial issues in an accidental way. It's like, well, it just happens to be the case that if you look at it from a certain way, seems like, as opposed to historically being based on some sort of intent. So I just want some sort of clarification on that.
First of all, that's an incredible question. And I think that it's a profound conversation and kind of like thought-provoking process of how do you come to light and how do you see it as a system. And I think for me, the way I came to the enlightening is that everybody has an individual experience and an individual story. And if you only base what happens on your individual experiences, you'll miss the bigger picture. And I think that's where history and to really know your history is, because then that starts kind of fleshing out where you fit within that particular group or within society in general. So until I started learning the history and learning about my culture and about my people, is that all of a sudden I realized that there was much more to my existence in this country than just me and my family's experience. So I think that's one way of doing it. And also, it kind of, when you start hearing stories over and over and over again, you're like, this can't be a coincidence. Like, this is something that's being done, and this is something that is very systematic. And just in the news the other day, they were talking, Maryland has an issue about disciplining 3 to 4-year-olds and actually suspending them for behavior that is inappropriate. 3 and 4-year-olds are getting suspended. Like, this is serious. And then you start reading the story and you're kind of going, oh, this is crazy. This is just nuts. And then you start going down the story and you start realizing that they're talking about black and brown children at a larger rate. So you start adding history, gives you a perspective of where you are today, but then what's happening today in this instant, it's not coincidental. You start looking at the patterns of what people of color are experiencing in our society, and that kind of informs my awakening or my thought process. And once again, you can't ignore, you could maybe ignore 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 instances that happen at the same time, but when you see it repeated amongst a group of people over and over again, it's a reality. We refuse to label it as such.
I think there's this phrase that I think comes, I remember hearing Donald Rumsfeld use it. He said, you know what you don't know, you know what you don't, you know what you know, you know what you don't know, you don't know what you don't know. And the reason why I like that terminology, that frame, that those questions, that series of questions, is because I think sometimes there are certain questions that you don't know to ask, so you never ask them, right? I remember when I was teaching at a debate camp a few years, this is back in 2008, and there was, it was a student, it was a class in Baltimore I was teaching. We had a couple of students from New York, and I'll never forget, this young white girl named Erica Tanner. And Erica was from New York and had debated teams. There's a movement in debate now where like race and racism is a central part of their practice in debate and criticizing the activity itself. And so sometimes they're called like performance teams. And so she was talking about, so it was kind of the introduction to the lab, and people were kind of going around, talking about their experience in debate. And so when she started out, she said, yeah, I debated some performance teams that talked about race. I thought it was so abusive. I thought it was so terrible. Like, why are people talking about race? It doesn't matter. It's over. I don't get it. And she didn't know who I was at this point, because I had just won a national championship doing, that kind of debate. So she had no idea. And so what was really interesting is that as time went on, we would always have these sessions where she would start asking me questions that I thought were really interesting questions, but that she had never had to ask them. And so, for instance, one of the questions she would ask, she would say, she would ask me, she was like, well, didn't racism end? And the question I would ask her back is, well, tell me when. Give me the event, the time, the thing that happened that racism was over, And she never knew to ask, to ask that question. And so it's just interesting. I think sometimes what happens is that there's just certain questions that people they just didn't think to ask themselves. Things that they never. One other quick story. When I was debating in nationals, it was semifinals. I was debating the team from which one of the debaters, he was like top speaker at the tournament. And so one of the questions I asked him in cross-examination, I said, do you think we live in a society that is racially integrated? And he said, yes. And I asked him how he knew. And he said, well, I bought a bong from a black guy, a couple of days ago, and that was what he said. This is like the top debater in the country at this point, right? Who thinks his understanding of racial integration is that. Because he never thought about it beyond the fact that, there's data. 85% of white folks live in communities where it's either exclusively or almost all white folks that live in those communities, right? But he would know that because that's not a question he ever thought to ask. So just in terms of your question, I think a part of it is beginning to start to ask those questions that you never thought to ask that can then put all the other stuff in context. Because once we had those conversations and she started asking those questions, she became one of the white debaters on the circuit that was making arguments about race because she started asking those questions, and she became so incensed that she had never thought about it that it became a part of her work.
I'd like to suggest an activity timelining that kind of prompted epiphany for me, even in my own life, as someone who tries to be conscious of these things. Like if you can plot, and I'm a visual artist, so I like to do it, where I could see it. I spread out. I started in a sketchbook, but it wasn't working, so I ended up on my studio wall. But everybody might have a family table someplace. This could be your activity to do in addition to having just a discussion on a holiday. Plot the trajectory of your family history, or even just your own history. You started going, maybe you went to college. What was going on in the country and the world at the same time when you started going to college? What was going on at the time when your grandparents got married, if they did? What laws were being passed? What wars were being fought? Where were y'all living in the country? What was going on right there? What was everybody working through the years? And it's amazing to see how things line up. It will prompt a revelation. Yeah. And think about, if you don't know your history, and this comes up a lot in indigenous communities, because we're the only people on the face of the earth that has to carry a card saying what race we are and how much of it we are. And a lot of times the requirements to get that card, you have to prove your ancestry up to such and such a date. And as people of color who were systematically oppressed, that's incredibly difficult to do. It's just playing right into this whole system of oppression. But think about the time when you don't know your family history and what happened when you started knowing. How far can you go, and what lines up in the world, in the country, in history at that point? Why do you know up to this point?
I want to give a big thank you to the panel and for sharing so much of your own experience and your wisdom with us, and ask you if you have any closing comment that you want to add that you didn't get to say so far.
Well, just because I like to talk, I'll go on with you. The one thing I would say is that this is a process. So even if you are compelled to do this work, know that because we live in a society that really supports Euro-centric ideology, that you too have been breathing the same air, you have been experiencing the same thing in your life. So you too will enjoy sometimes living in that world. And all we could ever ask for is really, or what I could ask for, is that you take a moment to really think about your own privilege and when you're enjoying it and how you could stop enjoying it and really working towards systemic change. But know that you will falter, much like I know that I mess up sometimes, and sometimes I use my white skin to get me things. But also getting pissed at yourself for doing that, and then forgiving yourself, and then trying again.
Something I was thinking about saying that I think might fit here is that in thinking of, I use what I know, Indian identity, like I was just talking about blood quantum and issues of proving how much Indian you are, how far back can you prove your ancestry, and so on and so forth. A Lumbee scholar and a friend of mine makes the point that our culture, Lumbees in particular, but I think it might be true of all cultures, might be, from my perspective, is that culture is fluid. It evolves. It's additive in nature, not subtractive. For example, my mom married a white guy and had me. That doesn't mean I'm only one half of a person. Either way. So consider how the dominant American culture is part of your own culture or isn't, and like who are you honoring? Which part of your identity are you honoring in your acts? Like, just be deliberate about what you celebrate.
I want to close by actually reading a statement that I stole from a DAR to just kind of summarize the position that BRJA as an organization takes on this whole topic that we've been discussing tonight. Our holidays are more than holidays. They are identifiers of cultural norms, and they reinforce societal narratives. When we celebrate the 4th of July uncritically, without acknowledging that historically the 4th of July applied only to free whites, when we celebrate Thanksgiving uncritically, without acknowledging the devastating impact of colonization on those native to this continent, when we as a country place some holidays above others by federally sanctioned days off, we're making choices about what stories and what histories are important, valued, and part of the national frame of this country. And when we do that, we are putting groups of people above other groups and telling the rest that they have to assimilate and lose their respective histories and stories. We understand the backlash. People who've had their histories and stories front and center now feel as if something is being taken away. This conversation asks that people examine those feelings and think about how the people who never had that privilege feel. And to think about how we can make space for all stories and histories to be included in the holiday framework. And to think about what it says about our country that they are not. So I want to thank all of you for being here, for participating, for your great comments and questions, and to encourage you to, if you're not already signed up, to get information on BRJA activities, including these 13th of the month events, to please go on our website and get on that list so that you're aware of the activities that we're doing. And I'm so happy that we kind of, through our last question, ended up on the topic of systemic or structural racism, because that's really what BRJA is all about. It all links to our own stories, our own individual stories and histories, but it's really about a whole system that we need to come together and change and make it truly equitable and just. So thank you very much for being here.